Welcome to Our Drummers Musicians, your backstage pass to Melbourne's vibrant music scene. Recorded on a cosy couch in Brunswick, join us as we explore what it truly means to be a musician as we speak to the diverse talents that make music in our city. Today's guest, Tim Mallis, is a Melbourne-based musician, renowned for his composition skills and work as an accompanist. A passionate advocate for music education, Tim is dedicated to bringing new Australian compositions to the forefront. He earned his Bachelor of Music from the Melbourne Conservatorium, majoring in pipe organ and composition, and has pursued further studies abroad. Tim boasts an impressive resume, highlighted by his extensive involvement with choirs as a performer, accompanist and teacher, and awards for composition and performance. Currently, Tim holds diverse positions with the Australian Boys Choir, Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, Opera Australia, the Victorian Opera, and continues to thrive as a freelance performer and composer. Join us as we dive into Tim's world, exploring his passions and asking if his perfect pitch is as enviable as it seems to the rest of us. We want to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land in which this podcast was recorded. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Hey, how you going?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, great. I love that intro.
Oh, thanks very much. It's a bit of fun.
Yeah.
First question. What is the most recent album that you've listened to?
This is terrifying because it wasn't actually a real album.
Uh-oh.
I've had this like deep dive recently into AI music production.
Oh.
The most terrifying thing that I've ever experienced in my life. So the most recent thing that I've listened to was not made by a human.
Whoa.
Which I'm like, okay, great. My career is about to be over. This is just fantastic. But yeah, I've just been going this deep dive into all of these. Like if you've seen anything like the ChatGPT or the visual stuff equivalent for music.
Wow.
Text prompt goes in, boom, you're like, all right, I want a funky vibe for like a podcast about Melbourne musicians. You like pop it in and then suddenly it produces this, funky kind of thing. And you're like, it's almost convincing.
Whoa. Really? So like real instruments or is it all electronic sounds?
You know what? It's because of imagine it being this sort of like garble of words that you would normally have for ChatGPT and it's trying to like recreate that in sort of the sound. So it's got what would be convincing like instrument sounds, but it sort of tries to put them together in a very sort of like I am a human kind of way.
Okay.
Which is, it's obviously in the same way of ChatGPT, you're like, something a bit off about this.
Yes.
But you're like, there's potential. And
Wow.
You're like, okay, great. This is something that could be devastating.
Yeah. So were you writing in the prompts or were you listening to something someone else had prompted through?
Bit of both.
Okay.
Bit of both. And I think it's a great source of comedy because you can start to put in stuff. You're like, okay, great. I'm going to write a song about poop. This is fantastic. I love it. But at the same time, like, okay, well, you can actually do some proper music. I think what was really revealing about it, just to go into this sort of like strange tangent into AI music, but what was really interesting about it was what genres it was best at and which ones it was worst at. And I think that the ones that were really interesting were things that were really, sort of compressed or really sort of typical styles. Like if you go for like, okay, I'm going to go for like a pop ballad in this particular style, and you're like, okay, great. That's like a very sort of like self-contained genre, and you're like, okay, I know what to expect from that. There's that. All right, okay. Now do some like free jazz or something, and it's like, well, it doesn't really know what to look for because it's such a sort of diverse, like sort of wibbly wobbly kind of genre. There's nothing really going on there, so it doesn't really know what to latch onto.
Right.
And I think it really struggled, especially with jazz and classical music, which is what I'm more familiar with. So I'm like, okay, well, my job's safe for a little bit longer at least.
Wow. It is quite scary thinking about all the different things that these new AI models can do. I know I was talking to a graphic designer about, some different ideas for my podcast logo. And they were like, well, if you just put it into an AI prompt now, it will just continually spit all types of different inspirations. And then you can just, go from there and create something your own. But it'll help you with all these, personal visualizations. I just felt so conflicted because I was like, I'm making a musicians podcast about musicians, and we're artists and we're all in the same sort of world. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, but I could outsource this creative project to something that is not real, but it does something, and it's like you said, it's like it's sort of good, but it's not quite. Like, oh, if something feels a bit off, and it's so scary to think that it's not the robots have taken over all the industry and is doing all the manual labor. It's like doing reading comprehension, it's doing language modeling, and now coming for like visual and music art. It's pretty scary.
Yeah, but you know what was really interesting, what you said, was that like having it outsourced, I think that's the real key there, is it? And you talk about like the inspiration of it. And I think that's the way that we can, at least for the moment, we can be at least, slightly positive about it, of going like, okay, well, it's doing what we do in terms of trying to collect all of the information about that particular art and go, here's what I think might be an interesting way of doing this based on everything that I've seen.
Right.
But it doesn't do the work for you because it's kind of given you like it's given you a broader picture of what you might want. But then you go, you have the taste to say, I don't think that works, or I think that works. And I think that's where the artistry can come into play, is you can go, you have the ability to not just collect information, you have the ability to actually like discern what is good.
Yep.
And say, I can run with this idea and go with it. What you're really outsourcing is just the collection of the information, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So what's happening with your composition work at the moment? Like, have you used any of this modeling to help you with anything that you're writing?
Yes and no. What was really interesting about this is I did use it for some help recently. I have to say I'm really terrible at writing lyrics for stuff, generally. I like words. I like working with words. I love finding really good poetry and interesting texts and going, oh, I can like hear some music behind that and I want to sort of write something based on that. But I'm really not good with the writing of it. I suppose it's probably just a practice thing, and if you forced yourself to write down something, you probably could. And I have done some recently with some writing for children, but which is even even more tricky sometimes. But I did have this project idea which I wrote recently, which was a set of pieces that were based on rhyming recipes.
Okay.
So essentially, what you got, all right, I'm gonna sort of spit some words here, and I'm gonna go, okay, all of this is actually a recipe, but it works as a poem as well. So, for example, there was a poem by Sidney Smith, who's this is like 18th century poet now, who actually no, it was more recent than that. That's right. but though it was just a poem called Potato Salad, for example. So it was like, to make this condiment, the poet begs the pounded yellow of 2 hard-boiled eggs. What was it? 2 mashed potatoes sift through kitchen sieve, to the salad give, like things like that. But like you go through it and it's like a recipe that you could theoretically follow. And it's like, this is a really like dumb, cool thing to write some music about as like a kind of a comedy thing. So I wrote a set of 5 pieces based on that. There's like a German one, there's like a French one, really sort of like eclectic bits of text that I was trying to find for that. But then I felt like there were a couple of movements missing. So, and I couldn't really find any other texts that I really sort of latched onto. So I was like, okay, well, I wonder what, a text-based language model type thing would be able to do in terms of actually sourcing text for that sort of thing and being like some inspiration about like what a recipe for this thing might be. And it did help me with trying to find a recipe for had one for banana bread, which I did as a kind of calypso sort of vibe, which is actually kind of funny because I looked up bananas later and they're not from Central America, so I was like, okay,
right,
it's not really going to help me, but but the vibe was there, so I was like, okay, that's great. And then another one for something else, another dessert. So I was like, this is great, but that was really interesting as well because that was well, I've collected all the information that I want to now, and that can sort of help me sort of inspire to sort of finish off the piece rather than write the piece for me.
Yes.
It was just sort of keeping that going, sort of, a bit of an aid for writer's block and that sort of thing too. So that was
interesting.
That was quite good. Yeah.
Because I remember coming to I can't remember if it was your final recital or an honors one that you'd done. And it was, it was choral compositions that you'd done, but extremely weird and eccentric lyrics.
Yeah.
I don't know, is it something that you just have a penchant for niche choral works, but with outrageous lyrics?
You know what? I would like to think so. But I think that that's a principle of mine in terms of as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say I rage against this, but I get really uncomfortable by groups and artists that don't think about what the end product is going to be for the audience in terms of, is this actually going to be interesting? Is it going to be fun? Is this something that I'm going to actually enjoy rather than just being fun for the artist? In that, as a sort of internal fulfillment as opposed to an external fulfillment, which is really what we do. We're making music and we have to think about how that's going to be received, because it's really, to a point you can entertain yourself, but I think it's really important, especially with live music. People have paid to come and see you, and if they're bored, there's really no point in doing what you're doing. And I suppose this might not be a topic that people really think about outside of classical music, really. I think this is a really big sort of struggle that's always been the case for this sort of genre of art music, where really the primary focus is the art. And this sort of talks about, aesthetics and all this sort of thing. And it's do you do things for, just yourself? Do you do things for others? But I think that line of where you've crossed to actually go into someone's world and say, hey, here's something that, could really sort of inspire you, be really interesting for you, be really fun in some cases. That's been a real focus of mine. And I think that a lot of the time we get lost trying to achieve that. So in terms of the texts that I choose, I think that it's, if you're listening to the text in such a way that it's oh, that's kind of odd and interesting and something I wouldn't sort of have in a cookie cutter, here's a choir piece or here's a vocal piece that's it's just another song about the leaves on the trees and I'm going to, the typical sort of art song type things.
Yes.
It's well, here's a song about, Aristotle really trying to grapple with, do fish actually dream because their eyes don't blink? It's it's just, silly stuff like that. So, yeah, which I think was the piece that you probably would have listened to.
Yeah. It was.
Yeah. Which is great fun.
Where do you think that passion of yours has come from? Because it was quite interesting hearing you say that about the classical world, and it definitely being about art music and the whole, is the music for the performer or the composer, or is it for the audience? And I was talking on the last episode with the singer and DJ Amber Ferraro about that same idea, sort of, because we were thinking about this concert that we saw at when we were in New York at doing a short course at NYU, where the professors played this avant-garde free jazz performance that was so sonically dissonant and uncomfortable that people immediately started leaving the concert. And it's probably a similar thing of, well, who is the music for, and is it trying to evoke a response, and are they thinking about the audience, or is it just something purely for the artist and the artist's enjoyment and nothing else sort of matters? So from the classical framework, is that something that you had noticed like coming up in that tradition and thought, oh, it seems so much of the art music is not thinking about the people? Or was that something like that you were taught by some of your studies or, different inspirations?
Yeah, a bit of both. I just from my own background, I've had a really sort of really a very classical background. I've worked a lot with choirs over the last 20 years.
Yep.
And worked with some really inspirational people who have really sort of defined my worldview in that sense. In terms of like, okay, well, can you see things from the other side? And I think as a composition student at the conservatorium, that was probably a really big eye-opener for that, because you're like, okay, well, I have zero budget, I have zero resources, but I still need to make a concert, and I still need to make, make some kind of connection for people to actually come to your concert, and also for performers who are really just your mates who are working for free. And tying all of that together was really the driving force for that sort of thing. And I think it's interesting you talked about that free jazz concert with the professors, and I think it's really a fine line as well between, like, you can have avant-garde and be experimental and really push boundaries, but to what end, I think, is the real question to that. Are you doing it to show off, as a professor may do? Are you doing it to take something and then take it further? Is that what you're trying to do? Or are you just sort of, splurging and sort of, having a sort of mess on the floor of just like, here are all the notes, deal with it. Like, that's the one that really gets me. And I'm like, I don't think that that's actually a good intention, if that's the intention that is actually being brought forth there. So it's like, how do you want that, that sort of mess of notes to be perceived? And if you've thought about that, there might be more of a case to say, well, that's probably a little bit more, something that we actually want in the music scene. Mm-hmm. And the opposite could be really damaging as well, because it's like, okay, am I just a people pleaser? Am I just a, machine that's just trying to hit that sort of benchmark target of like, I'm just going to make stuff that people like and not think about it in terms of like creative drive and pushing any boundaries that might exist. So the opposite is also quite damaging. So it's really finding that balance. And I would say, especially in the classical music scene, that is a balance that's usually too far to that end of just sort of, just doing the art and not thinking too much about, how can you engage with an audience?
Yeah. What's it been like, because you're holding and doing quite a few different things with different major classical organizations here in Melbourne.
Sure.
And you don't have very much creative control necessarily in some of the things that you're seeing happen. Yeah. So what's it like when you're thinking about all of these major concepts, but then watching like the reality of, I'm in this organization that, maybe just putting out the same concert series that they've done for the last, 100 years.
Yeah.
When you're like, oh, well, this is not like bringing Australian new music to the forefront, or, we're just pandering to a extreme niche of classical art music, but, where's the audience gone? Like, what's it like for you as, someone coming into that world?
Yeah, I think really taking everything with a grain of salt for a start. But at the same time, like, even though you might not have creative control, so to say, of what's being programmed and what's being chosen as the repertoire and that sort of thing, as a participant in that artistic space, you do have influence and the ability to create more opportunities for others to explore their creative capabilities. I think that's the real key. And I think this is where being a piano accompanist is a really interesting role, especially working across a number of different groups and seeing how different conductors work, how different groups respond to certain things. As an accompanist, you can really influence about how the rehearsal process is going to go, how the audience is going to engage with the piano versus the choir, how you might inspire the choir or inspire the conductor even to then give a sort of feedback loop of like, oh, you know, I've sort of hinted at doing something in this particular way on the piano, and then the conductor goes, oh, that's really interesting, and sort of might gesture in a particular way to the choir, which then feeds back to me, and that's when the magic happens. And I think that alone can inspire an audience. And I think that's really what classical music has tried to do for a very long time. And when it's successful, it is magic. And you look at the really top music groups in the world, the really top orchestras. You look at Berlin Philharmonic, for example, and you watch their performance, and it's just so engaging. Even though they might be doing repertoire by a dead composer from 200 years ago, the way that they have that synergy and all of that sort of presence in the moment and connecting with each other inspires the audience to go along with them on that journey.
Yes.
So I think to answer your question, really, it's I might not necessarily have creative control over a situation, but to be able to inspire other people to create that energy that's the magic. And that's something that I love as a collaborating musician.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And I'm sure that applies really across the board, but can be difficult to find sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, because I know a bit about your arranging, your composition work and arranging, but also the accompanying stuff. Can you tell me a bit about the different roles that you've had? Because I know you recently be doing some things with the MSO,
sure,
but also these other roles, with the different operas that we mentioned in your intro.
Yeah. Okay. Well, most of my work with opera companies, especially with Victorian Opera and Opera Australia, has been as a surtitle operator, which has been a really, speaking of niche things.
Extremely.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's really interesting, and I'm sure that, like me, hardly anyone knows what that is. Okay. And I thought it would be fun to, learn more.
Yeah. Okay. So imagine that you're watching a foreign film, or foreign TV show or something, and you've got your subtitles at the bottom. We do that live for opera. That's essentially what it is. So if you go to an opera, rather than seeing subtitles, which would be at the bottom of the screen,
yes,
you're going to have surtitles at the top of the screen, or the stage.
Okay.
So while the singers are doing their thing, they're singing in Italian, they're singing in German, French, Russian, doesn't matter, whatever. We'll do live translations on the screen so you can understand what's going on the stage, which seems pretty okay at first, because you're like, okay, well, you just put in all the text. It's kind of like PowerPoint. You're like, bam, 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 bam. All right, it's fine. The complications only begin there. So for a start, you've got to make sure your text is correct, because very often we'll get text from different companies around the world, different opera companies around the world, and they come in and it's not the right format, or there are typos, or the grammar's not correct, or it's not the right size for each slide, so you have to adjust all those things. So that's okay, great. We've got all of that in. And then you think about, okay, well, what about these beautiful opera things where you go starting a phrase out of nowhere, and then it fades away to nothing, and then if you just go bam and the text comes up on the screen, you're like, well, that was kind of ruined it. And especially if it's a punchline. If there's a comedic moment, you're just like, and then bam, there's the text. And then you're like, oh, I missed the joke. So fades and timing with the singers on stage and making sure you're watching the conductor and all those sorts of things is super important too. You're like, okay, great. And then the other thing is how do you know when to do things? How do you know actually when that bit of text is coming up? You've got to have a music score, and you've got to mark up all of that. So kind of like a stage manager would.
Yeah.
So it's a combination really of sort of, loving language and knowing what to look for with that. It's also about having really good, sort of score reading and musical intuition skills. And then there's a bit of tech as well. You got to know, what you're doing. We use a sort of QLab based type. It's like Surtitles specific software, which is great.
Okay.
I know that some people use PowerPoint and things as well, but there is Surtitles software out there. So and really combining all of those things into something that people probably won't notice, which is a good thing.
Yes.
If you haven't noticed that that's there, then you've done your job well. And that's a common theme with a lot of things too, with what I've done over the years, in that I feel like my roles have very much been supporting acts, and I really like that in terms of like sort of giving that undercurrent of creative energy and like knowing that the whole production of whatever is going on is made slightly, just that little bit better, just by your presence. So the Surtitles is great for that. Yeah.
I suppose if you're working as an accompanist and everyone's going, wow, that accompanist was amazing.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably,
right.
You might be detracting a little bit.
Yeah, totally. You're like, I could hear the pianist the whole time. Yeah. I couldn't hear the singer. It's just like, that's great. Yeah, no, that's true. There's a book by Gerald Moore, who was a very famous accompanist, and the title of the book was Am I Playing Too Loud?
Okay.
Which is actually it was a really provocative title as well, because he talks about that whole, connection with whoever you're playing with and those sorts of things too. But yeah, it's that concept as well of just, being a part of a whole and contributing in that way.
Yeah. Well, I guess speaking of provocative titles,
Ooh.
What do you think it is that really makes a musician?
What? Oh, what do you mean?
Well, I like the concept of the podcast name.
Yeah.
Are drummers musicians?
Oh,
because it's going, well, what is it to be a musician? Like, it's fun that there's all these drummer jokes about, things like that. And I was chatting to some singers, and, singers get all these jokes too.
Totally, yeah.
And, it's a bit of the poking fun of like people are in clubs and, it's a bit of jest. But then at other times, it's a bit of a serious thing where people really go like, oh no, that person's not a musician. They're just doing this thing and it's separate.
Yeah.
Or they're just up the back counting rests and they hit a crash cymbal at the end. Like it is. But you've had like you said, like lots of different side roles, and even listening to like the way you described the surtitle role, it's almost like you are playing an instrument, because you have to be in time and you have to be able to read all the music. And yes, there's all these technical things, but just like any other member of the orchestra, you have to click your surtitle moment at the right point with everybody else in the orchestra.
Absolutely. And we didn't really talk about organ playing as well, but really that's just pressing a button. Press a button at the right time. Doesn't matter how hard you press that button, but if you press it the right time, in the right way, you're probably going to be okay. Yeah.
So is that all it is to be a musician? Just someone that does something at a right moment?
Yeah, I don't know. A bit like I think in that vein of like, our drummers musicians, I could not possibly dream of ever becoming a drummer. It is far too difficult for anything that I could possibly imagine. And I think that anything that requires that sort of skill requires the respect that it deserves. So, of course, drummers are musicians. There is no question about that. Are surtitles musicians? I'll be on the fence about that, but I there's a good case for it. But I think it's again having that perspective of being like, okay, well, what is it that you're doing, and what brings you to that moment where you're like, okay, well, I am actually making music, and that means that, or I'm even just creating art, and that means that you have contributed to society in some way that is like, okay, we've done something that is just so abstract and so away from the whole financial, political, everything else world that you're like, okay, well, that's just created something. You're done. No question about what you're doing. That's just art. And I think that to say whether you're a musician or not really speaks to is it music? And that's a really interesting aesthetic question too, of like, well, is sound music, is noise music, but is organized sound and organized noise music? And I think that's really a distinction where you can say, okay, well, I hear a bird chirp. Now, the bird isn't a musician necessarily, but you interpreting that and that bird maybe having a musical intention for those things, that makes it music. So in that sense, your ear and the bird have had a little bit of an interpretive dance together to say, all right, we've made some music there. But and I think, and like, okay, well, if you're listening or hearing, if you're listening to something being, you're actually engaging with the sound as opposed to maybe just hearing it passively and not sort of connecting to it, that might be the difference between whether you are making music or not, and therefore whether you're a musician or not. So that's an easy benchmark to say that, drummers are musicians. It's so easy.
It was interesting. I was like, when you were saying, you couldn't do that because it's like so difficult. It's interesting to think about like the different complexities of different instruments and the different roles. But like of all of them, you play the pipe organ, which like drums involves all four limbs, except like to another degree because you use all 10 digits, and you not only play all of the notes, you also pull all of the stops.
Sure.
So, as far as coordination goes, I think that you take it a significantly level higher, being able to play, with all of your different fingers. All I do is just hit things with different hands.
Yeah. I was having a really interesting conversation about difficulty of instruments a while back, and there was a friend of mine who was absolutely, positively convinced that the piano was the most difficult instrument done. And I was like, that's actually a really interesting question, because it's like, the piano isn't actually that hard to play. Because you can walk up to a piano and you can press a note and suddenly you've made a sound. And if you walk up to a French horn and you don't know embouchure, you don't know how to actually create a sound with it, surely that's more difficult, right? But then, as I was thinking about this more and more, it occurred to me that every instrument is the most difficult instrument. Because the music that's been written for that instrument or has been created for that instrument is as difficult as it is to play that instrument, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't do certain things on a French horn that you could do on a piano. And similarly, you couldn't do some things that you can't do on a piano that you could do on a French horn. And they're just as difficult as each other, because the threshold for difficulty is just how difficult can it be to play that instrument for everyone? It's yeah.
That's so true.
So as a drummer, to be able to coordinate all of those things is equivalent to coordinating all of the things on an organ because of the nature of that instrument. If that sort of makes sense in that, in that sphere, because it's like, well, okay. And, actually really funny with an organ as well, because that's the same thing. If you pulled a stop at least and you press a note on the keyboard, again, you've made a sound. So that's pretty easy, right? If you pressed a button. So yeah, that's difficulty is a weird sort of, I think a concept that we've sort of put into our brains of like, that's a difficult instrument, while actually saying, well, no, they're actually all just as difficult as each other. And I think what's really interesting too, I've got a colleague of mine who's a really, this is going to sound pretty funny, but he's an absolute avid recorder player. Like, as in, like the the instrument that you'll play in primary school, and sort of go, the teacher goes, all right, go do into the instrument, and everyone goes, yeah. Like that's not helpful. But really into that instrument, which was a really significant instrument, in the especially in the 18th century.
Yeah.
And again, an easy instrument to make a sound out of. Being a really consummate artist on that instrument is really tricky. You have to think about, all the phrasing, all the articulation, all of the way that you're producing the sound. Are you tuning correctly as well? Because, you might have specific intervals that you're like, oh, I'm going to make that one slightly more sharp because that suits that phrase, and like all of those things as well that you would think about in any instrument. And the threshold for that is as difficult as anyone can make it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would absolutely agree that every instrument is just as difficult as all the others. But looking at it from the perspective of, oh, you could walk up and start one, like, it's quite easy to play something simple that sounds nice on the piano,
Sure.
but it's not on the violin or the French horn or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there's different thresholds to like simplicity of entry.
Totally.
And I would think that drums is probably right up there with like one of the most simple to get started.
Yeah.
Because most rock songs, well, almost all of the drum beat is the same for like 90% of music. It's just eighth notes on the hi-hat, a snare drum on 2 and 4, and the kick on 1 and 3 or all 4.
Right. Yeah.
And you can play that drum beat, even if it's not the same beat that the drummer's playing on the song that you like from the genre that you like. You can still fit that beat over almost all of the songs.
Yeah.
And there's like worlds of complexity beyond that. But the bar to entry for someone beginner to say, I like this song, and as long as it's in like some kind of like pop or rock or funk or soul, any kind of like contemporary music, they can just play that 4/4 beat along with the song.
Yeah, right.
And they can do it. Welcome. You're now a drummer.
Yeah. There's and that's really interesting as well. Yeah, it's like sort of entry thresholds for things. And I think also just like thinking about it too, you might think about like what is the most intuitive, like walking up to the instrument, so to say? Like what, like, is it tactile? Is it something you can like hit? Is it something you can touch? Or is it something more abstract where you have to be a little bit more, I don't know, cerebral when you have to first get to it? Like if you walked up to a bassoon, for example, you got a double reed and you got everything you have to think about there. Not as intuitive maybe as, touching something. And you're like, okay, well I've hit a drum and that's easy enough. But I now have to use my lips and my mouth shape and tongue, which is not as really as intuitive. You like walk up to something to make a noise. So maybe that's a aspect of that too, where you're like, okay, well, entry level, fine, but everything else, like the sort of that, peak of professionalism or whatever it is the same for all instruments.
Yeah.
But maybe it's that entry level that makes it a little bit more interesting. Yeah.
Well, what do you think about, like, you've done so much with the Australian Boys Choir, like as a performer, but also, you teach there.
Sure.
Is that maybe the most accessible thing to do, to come in and sing?
Well, that's actually a really good point. Isn't that like something that, anyone with a voice can do to some ability? And that is really, and it's a really primal thing too, isn't it? Of actually, and it's, it's the first instrument that we've ever used because we're born with it, like we're built with it. But yeah, that's always a really interesting thing too. And then you think about mastery of voice is just as difficult to achieve as everything else. And I think too that like, I don't know if you've spoken with other singers on this podcast about this, but I think it's really interesting too that thinking about the voice as an instrument, as any other instrument, is super important because you really have to think about, okay, well, if this is an instrument, I have to look after it like I would with any other instrument. I'm not going to, leave it on the road. I'm not going to destroy it by doing X, Y, and Z. I need to make sure that I'm not getting fatigued from practice. I need to make sure that I'm practicing enough as I would with any other instrument. And then it's like, well, it is an instrument, but it's also, a set of muscles and part of your body. So a fine line between, if you're exercising, you're going to produce the same principles of exercise versus practice. And there are a lot of overlaps there generally with other instruments anyway. So, so to answer the question of are vocalist musicians, absolutely. They're playing an instrument that's just inside them. But I think that's really interesting as well. I find that a really inspiring thing of working with children who come into a choir who already love to sing in some way and then taking that musicianship to the next level and saying, well, you've got a voice and we know that, that's great. How can we now make music together in a way that we are all collaborative, inspired, and able to learn something on the way? And I think that's awesome. And I think that's a really inspiring thing for me as a musician as well, to take back and go, well, these kids have basically learnt how to read music in, 3 years or whatever it is. And, what have I been doing for the last 3 years? not in a bad way. I'm like, oh, damn, I haven't actually done anything with my life. But in a way of like, well, what can I do to have that same inspiration to improve myself as a musician, and say, okay, well, I might not be learning, tars and TTs and, crotchets and whatever, but I might be taking my musicianship to the next level and saying, okay, well, I might be able to do that in this area. I might be, if it was composition things, I might push myself to write for a different instrument or write in a, different fusion genre or something like that. You think about those things constantly when you're working with that music education that really inspires those children. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, like, before we started recording about, the different work you've done and trying not to get stuck. And I sort of thought, oh, maybe that sort of applies here. And you could share a little bit more about that, because you've done so much pipe organ work and choral arrangement work with, like a big series of different churches. And you've sort of moved on from doing that quite recently. Was that about not being, pigeonholed, or wanting to develop more than just Tim Mallis is the choral arranger and pipe organist of, the series of large churches that you did that work for?
Sure. Yeah. And it is really interesting how you can get yourself typecast in that way. And it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think that people of different ages will have different answers for this. I think at my stage of my career, I'm not quite ready to be settled in a particular role.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for all musicians really to think about what it is that they want to do in that field and how to achieve that by working with different people, pushing yourself as an artist in different directions and all those sorts of things too.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was quite funny because I've been working with churches for quite a long time now as an organist and I suppose pianist and conductor in some cases. But I actually just I really enjoy just singing in a choir myself.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who works with choirs and is, usually in front of a bunch of, black and white notes in front of a choir, I don't get to sing as much.
Mm-hmm.
So stepping back from those roles allowed me, I was recently doing a project down at Monash University with polyphonic voices and the Melbourne Baroque Orchestra, and we did the St. Matthew Passion, which is a huge work for, 2 choirs, 2 orchestras, soloists, massive forces that I probably wouldn't have been able to commit to if I was always doing the organ stuff or whatever. So, so having the flexibility to step back is something that I've had to work really hard at to make sure that I've been able to have that flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose this talks more broadly about being a musician in Melbourne, that, think of how many people are actually in a full-time single position music job, and there are so few. It's really limited to maybe universities, schools, some arts organisations, and that's really about it. And that like one full-time gig could sustain you for a living. But for the most part, we sort of have to cobble together this sort of weird combination of freelance and bits and pieces here and there. So that's really what I've really tried to do for the last however many years is, find that balance of like, well, I've got some stable income over here. I get to work maybe one-off with other people and organizations, and then other places sporadically, maybe, a once a week gig at this place and then once a Blue Moon thing at this gig, and just kind of cobbling all of that together and using that as a tool for flexibility to say, okay, well, maybe I can step back from that and look elsewhere and try and sort of push your boundaries in another direction. So, yeah, and that's really been a really big driver for that inspiration. And saying, well, if I maybe can't find inspiration here, maybe I can sort of move across and explore something else for a while and see, okay, well, maybe I can be inspired by that and really latch onto that with someone else. Yeah.
So what are you most looking forward to then about this year?
So this year, I have really sort of I've taken a step back from the full-time church work, but interestingly, that's now enabled me to do some ad hoc church work. So now I'm able to sort of I've worked with a number of churches across Melbourne, but I'm able to go to places I wouldn't have otherwise been able to because I was working every Sunday type thing.
Yes.
Because their only work was on, a Sunday morning or whatever. So so I'm really looking forward to working with some other people around Melbourne. The church music, scene is, at least in the sort of the Anglican churches and the sort of the high-end churches, which are like very sort of classical based music. That's a pretty niche group.
yeah, because we're talking like you either playing with the choir or on the organ in like very traditional style. Church music, I guess.
Yeah. And there's a pretty strong scene with the Anglican churches around Melbourne. There are a lot of sort of semi-professional singers and musicians who work across those areas.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's relatively tight knit in that sense, but that's also a bit of a downfall that I've found in that tight knittedness has created those barriers of like, well, you're creating all of this really great music together and you keep sort of recycling yourselves in those gigs, but you haven't made the effort to step outside that and either bring other people who definitely could do this, but you might not have otherwise sought out to actually bring them into the fold, or yourself to actually go elsewhere and say, well, I might find a different way of making this music at a different place. So if you actually Google it, you can actually find there are some fantastic people who've actually put together like lists of like all the choirs in Melbourne, like across every genre, like that's going to be gospel choirs, it's going to be church choirs, it's going to be children's choirs, it's going to be all of those choirs, and they put this list together. I found this list and I was astonished at how many different choirs there are.
Okay.
In the same sense, you might go, how many rock bands are there in Melbourne? Across every amateur scene possible. And you're like, how many musicians would that be?
Yeah,
How
many.
many people are actually doing the same thing that you are, that you haven't been able to connect with for whatever reason? And that kind of blows my mind. And that, I think, really states the importance of, at least in the classical world, open auditions and accessibility to connect with people who might otherwise not have that access to those things, and not just, you can work with your mates and go like, okay, well, that's someone who I know and I can trust, and go, okay, well, I can rely on that. But being brave and going, okay, well, I can also step outside that comfort zone and go, I can find someone else maybe who will inspire me in a different way. And I think it's really revealing the people who just focus on just their mates, and those who really make an effort to actually seek out other people to be able to work in that way. Yeah.
Oh, well, it'll be exciting to see what, the year brings out for you in all these different opportunities that come up now that you don't have the regular thing, but it's more freelance work. It'll be exciting to see, where it takes you.
Yeah.
I'd love to keep chatting, but this time has gone so fast. So you'll just have to come back on the podcast and talk to me more. I've been playing this game with guests where I ask you all to ask a question of the next guest.
Oh.
So I have a question for you from singer and DJ Amber Ferraro.
Great.
What is a nugget of wisdom that you've gotten from a teacher that you still remember to this day?
Oh, this is going to sound very classical, but practice, you silly person. I think.
Was that the specific? That was it, wasn't it?
That is my paraphrasing of all of my teachers.
Yes. Oh, okay.
But seriously, and like it sounds. It's just so cliche. It's so obvious, but you can't get away with doing the music without doing the hard work. Do the hard work, and that will give you the freedom to do what you want to do. And doesn't matter what kind of musician you are. Again, I just spoke about like vocalists before as well. I was like, doesn't matter what instrument you play, doesn't matter what you do in the music scene. You practice your craft in a way that you're not burning yourself out just by doing gig after gig and just forgetting to just step back and go, I need to work on these things, and just have that growth mindset of just always improve. And the way to do it, just practice. It's just it's as simple as that.
So simple, but it's clearly stayed with you, and you're a super talented musician. So clearly, there's a lot of practice that's gone into it too.
Talent is just practice. That's all it is, mate. And if you've enjoyed your practice, that's made it a bit easier to get there. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to finish up with 5 quick answer questions.
Go ahead.
What is your favourite venue to play in Melbourne?
Melbourne Recital Centre, the Elizabeth Murdoch Hall.
What is your dream venue to play at?
Probably the Philharmonic in Berlin. Astonishing venue. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
What is your coffee order?
Don't drink coffee. It's a hot chocolate.
Nice. Me too.
Hey.
What is your favourite place to get food after a gig?
Oh, it's got to be home. I'm sorry. I can't afford to go out.
Don't apologise. Hopefully some more work will come your way. And what is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
Believe that there is a way to be a professional musician, and that it is a genuine path that you can forge.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible.
That's great. And well done for being able to, make that path for yourself. I know it's been a long journey, but you've had so much success as a young musician, and also to have maintained your career for such a long time. I know you joke about not being able to afford food after a gig.
That's not strictly true. I can afford to feed myself. I choose to be at home. I like to economize.
Well, where can the listeners, connect with you, Tim, if they want to, commission a composition, or have you work with their choir, or perform at their church, or, are you on social media?
I am on social media. The best way to connect with me, I've got a website. If you go to Tim Mallis, timothymallis.com.au. I should know my own website. You can contact me through there. But yeah, you can contact me through social media as well. I occasionally post about my cat Chicken. But hopefully you can also get some music from that too.
Oh, cool. Well, thanks so much for coming, Tim. We'll have to do it again.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke.
No worries. Thanks for joining us on Our Drummers Musicians. I hope you enjoyed getting to know another Melbourne muso like I did. Help us grow by leaving a review, share the podcast with friends and family, and subscribe on our website for extra info. Got a guest you'd love to hear on the show? Please let us know at ourdrummersmusicians.com. See you next time.
That's all right. I don't even have a question yet, so I bought one.
All right, so Tim, what is your question for the next guest?
If you could spend as much time as you wanted and learn a new instrument from scratch, what would it be?
Nice. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
It's funny, Tony Floyd asked almost the same question.
Tony Floyd.
Who got it?
Oh.
Or maybe no one's answered it yet. His question was, if you could learn play another instrument, what would it be?
Yeah.
And then, if you could play it to the same level as your current instrument,
yeah, exactly.
would you swap?
Ooh, spicy.
Yeah. This is great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And thanks for reminding me to record.
Oh, you're right.